So the format of this, I think we're going to be a little loose with it. Feel free to ask questions at any time. We do have an outline, but I kind of don't expect to even get to configuration management, depending on how deployment goes. So yeah, let's just get started. You guys want to just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, I'm Weston Josie. I'm head of operations over at Tapjoy. I've got a couple of other Tapjoyers in the audience too. Mostly one of the guys who wrote all of our deployment software. So anything you actually hear me talk about, I really have nothing to do with. He's the smarter guy. Yeah, we're, as everybody else is also saying, we're hiring, and hopefully some of the stuff we'll talk about will pique your interest as to what we're working on. It's pretty cool.
Andrew Rollins, one of the co-founders of Localytics. We do app analytics. That means iPhone apps, Android apps, even HTML5 for the JavaScript apps as well. We're about 50 people, actually closer to 60 now. Just a few blocks from here. I work on a lot of the back-end technology stuff, so I do like the server deployment stuff, the infrastructure automation stuff, and a lot of the data processing pipeline. I got actually Matt from Localytics is also here. He's one of our data scientists on the services side. And in terms of our stack, we're on AWS. We use Chef for server automation, and then we do deployment automation using kind of a continuous integration process on Jenkins. And that's about it.
Matthew Barr, Cancer Tech. I'm the DevOps lead, and I just came in about 4 months ago, and I've rebuilt pretty much everything with Puppet, server side, we're AWS based at this point, with Jenkins, continuous integration type stuff, and that's pretty much what we do. Python, virtual based systems, which has its own special fun, as well as Ubuntu.
My name is Craig Tracy. I'm currently at a company called Bluebox. Bluebox, some of you may know, some may not, but it has a legacy product that does container type shared hosting for things like Travis CI. But now they have transitioned to a new product line, which is private single tenant hosted OpenStack, and that's the product that I'm working on right now. Prior to that, I've only been there a couple of months, but prior to that, I was at HubSpot. I was the cloud automation tech lead at HubSpot. There we use similar tools. We use Puppet, Chef, and at Bluebox now we use Ansible. So we've been around the config management space. I haven't done Solitude, so yeah.
Okay, cool. Are there any good platform as a service tools you guys are using for either deployment or configuration?
We're not actually using a PaaS solution, but our deployment solution is heavily influenced by the way that Heroku has basically publicized about how they actually do their deploys behind the scenes. We do what's called a slug-based deployment, so we also use Jenkins behind the scenes, so a developer or whoever's doing the release is able to basically say, here's a particular branch or here's a particular release that we want to build, and Jenkins will go out, download all that code, do a bunch of stuff to it, make sure it passes all its tests, and then package it into this nice little slug that we're then able to distribute it out across all our servers really quickly by putting it into S3 and distributing it out that way. So while we don't actually use a true platform as a service solution for actually doing the deployments, we have stolen a little bit of their ideas. So it's
Pretty much an identical answer.
Yeah.
For us.
So apparently you should be doing it too.
Well, I could add to that. There are things that I would want to change to do. The point of taking influences from Heroku is really good. I mean, we would kind of like to do more packaging of an isolation of the infrastructure from the day-to-day operations of each developer, so that they don't really have to think about what server things are going to. And there still is a little bit of that involved in deploying, and I would kind of like to move away from that. There's a bunch of projects and tools out there that are of interest in me.
So we're actually using Packer to build AMIs. We're actually using Packer to build AMIs, and those get pushed up into S3, obviously, EBS, snapshot and stuff. We also build our virtual ends and actually package those with FPM. If everyone's heard of that, it's bleeping package management. Package manager really good. Jordan Seisel wrote it. He also wrote Logstash, which if you're not looking at that, you probably should be. But we actually package stuff and we push the S3 and serve it out of there as a movement to meetup. So we update from
So one of the things we do at Blue Box is that we actually offer Cloud Foundry on top of Instant. And while I'm not using that specifically for my app because I'm standing up infrastructure, when I was at HubSpot, we essentially ended up doing the same thing, which was building essentially an in-house pass. We also used Jenkins to ship artifacts to S3, and then we used Fabric as the kind of deployment mechanism for plugging artifacts from S3 and dropping them on the boxes. One thing that was very nice about HubSpot is, so this was actually a huge debate at HubSpot for many years, is how do you name the servers? And one thing, we have people who are like functional naming. Some others were, totally meaningless, kind of UUID type based name, and we actually use mountain names. And so there's, some ungodly number of mountain names out there, and that's all that the developer needs to know. He needs to know what his mountain name is, and that's it. So, and at the same time, that developer should have expected that because it was in Amazon. When I was there, it was roughly around probably 1,500 steady state instances. That's all they cared about. They didn't have to care about anything else.
I actually have a question. I don't want to ask questions.
Yeah,
I will actually.
we got a question
yes,
first.
yes.
So you said mountain names were at HubSpot. So were those physical machine names, or were they?
No, it's all So Amazon, HubSpot is entirely cloud-based.
Oh, okay.
When I was there, we had regions. We had a single region, Ulysses, as well as some environments called rack spaces.
So none of those, I'm guessing you didn't use any auto scaling groups then.
No. So we're kind of delving down a different path.
Tell us about HubSpot.
So we actually had a tool that was built in-house. Actually, you guys started this. But it was called Rainmaker, and basically what it was is it's essentially an AWS console front. So you have a single user that is this Rainmaker user that is connecting to Amazon, performing all of the. We were using Bodo as the backend library, but when you say I want a new instance, the page comes up. It has a predefined name, some random mountain name, and you press condense, which is the term that we used, and 10 minutes later you have a machine in Amazon. I like that model because it kind of, especially I'm learning this even more now that I'm doing OpenStack for customers, is that there's a lot of ways for people to kind of shoot themselves in the foot. And when you build that kind of facade over the front of something like Amazon or OpenStack or even Rackspace, it kind of puts the users in a container. These are the things that you can.
As a side note, we're in the process of writing our own front end, but that's mostly so my devs don't ever have to look at the AWS console or APIs, so I can trust them a little bit better. But we actually do not use strange names. We actually have informative names, but use autoscale. So I can't actually tell. I can take the name and figure out what the machine is, but I can't go the other way for most of the systems because they don't. I don't know the UIDs dependent to the actual role. So it's like a role, web server, environment, stage, or prod, or dev, and then a region. I'm sorry, an AZ actually, and then the UID of the machine. That's the actual hosting. So when it shows up in, say, my logs, and I see an alert, I can actually see oops, something snuck through from, say, dev onto one of the IRC channel, or the Zilliq in this case. I actually see that it doesn't matter, because it's a dev box, it's 502, whatever. But I couldn't tell that before, but I just had UIDs or random names or whatever. As you scale out, it doesn't scale. So.
I guess we have the exact opposite. We don't use names at all.
That's where I was going,
yeah.
but I had to reverse myself on it because I was getting host names into log files. And people were like, what is this machine? I don't know.
Yeah, you know what?
We have them collective, though, to help find the machines and discovering stuff.
Right. Yeah, we do. So we just started going down the path of Logstash, like as you mentioned, which everybody should be doing as well. And I can see it becomes a bit more useful, especially when you get down that. I guess behind the scenes what's publicly facing to an engineer in the organization is probably just a regular public host name. But I guess internally there are ways to change it. But that's interesting. Our servers last for less than 36 hours. Our servers are rotated out constantly. So for us, there's a lot of.
So the names I have would actually be fine because I don't actually have the UID at the end, but it still shows information for us. By the way, if people haven't looked at something called Ryman, they should also look at that. RIEMANN. It's a nice counterpart to Logstash, and then it allows you to go ahead and do stats on data that are coming through like live metric streams. So AWS gives you metrics at the maximum resolution is 1 minute. The normal is 5 minutes. This can actually work on, you've gotten 5502 errors in the last 10 seconds, time to page. Or it's been 5 and 10 minutes, don't worry about it.
So I'm curious. So we've had our own experience. So it's interesting that we all are basically using a fairly similar approach, and it's something that we obviously, I think everybody here was probably influenced by how Heroku started to present a lot of their stuff, and a lot of those tools were built around it. So we obviously had scaled up to being a gigantic organization and lots of servers, hundreds of servers online at any given time, server production traffic that we need to rotate out really quickly, do large deploys to, and we obviously did not have this in place on day one. I don't know if you guys had it on place basically near day one, or so I'm curious as to what experience you guys had doing it, because I know for us it wasn't as simple as I'm just going to start using FPM and everything is going to work great. Yeah.
I can take it. It was especially painful. I mean, it was a never-ending thing, right? So the deployment tool was constantly in some iteration of improving or changing. In fact,
or getting worse sometimes, yeah.
And I mean, at that point in time, like these past solutions, besides Heroku, like if you pay for Heroku, you could go do that. But kind of the open source past solutions didn't really exist, so you end up kind of cobbling yourself. I think our first iteration was we could do this because all of our machines look the same, but we were taking virtual names, packaging them up, and shipping them around. That didn't really cut it once we started getting to different between CentOS 5 and CentOS 6, and we ended up adopting something similar to a Heroku style application deployment tool, but again, it was like an ever-evolving thing. It never ended. And that's dev cycles that you don't really need to spend.
Yeah.
So we kind of took everything was a measured response to something that happened or some need. There was only a few instances where we did a full kind of rehaul of our methodology. At one time, when we switched to Chef, I think it was the beginning of 2012. That was out of it. We were kind of just ad hoc writing scripts for certain end. We were using a little bit of Capistrano. We were using a free developer account on RightScale, which was so there was all these things cobbled together. RightScale called us one day and was like, "You guys have to pay now," and we were like, "Nope," and we just went to check. So we just kind of did a massive rewrite in a month or so. But there's been a lot of stuff that everything's kind of been in response to. Hey, we need this, so let's go write a bunch of stuff. I think now though, in the last year, so our team is growing really rapidly, and we're having this kind of moment where we're being more proactive than we are being reactive, and we're saying that we're going to have a major problem in being fast at doing deployments and fast at doing server infrastructure and auto-scaling and all that kind of stuff if we don't make kind of more of a deeper cultural shift towards thinking about these problems in a different way, more of like our own internal platform. So I would say that now, in the last few months, it's actually been more of a proactive thing.
So it's weird. I'm actually not doing things in reaction to what broke in most cases. I actually came out of Snap Interactive, which runs a large Facebook dating site. Before that, MarketServe, which is a financial services company. So I've been entirely data center based for almost my whole career. And this is the first time running AWS. So I basically did a ton of research as I was trying to ramp up to get into this stuff. And I've been paying attention to things for a while, trying to keep track of what breaks, what doesn't break, what works, what doesn't scale. And so I came in, they were running Salt, but it wasn't explicitly named machines and bunch of things like that, which just doesn't scale, so I held that and basically looked at things, and we're now looking at building our own dev, like a dashboard, but that's just because I know, I'm seeing how they do some of the deploys. Yeah, it's coming from Jenkins, but sometimes they're turning this off, this job off, this regression on, this on. It's just not a happy thing. I'm listening to what, I'm seeing what they're asking me for and what they need, and figuring out what we need to put in their dashboard for deploy tools and like log analysis and stuff like that. But really, we're kind of, I'm being proactive in most of it, just trying to see, go forward and trying to get ahead of where the curve should be. What's your answer?
What's my answer? Ours was an interesting experience. So I joined Tapjoy a year and a half ago via Viximo, and we joined on. I was one of two guys who kind of joined on and joined the infrastructure team, an infrastructure team of one. And so then there were three, right? And so to start, deployments weren't necessarily our focus. And then right around June, we really started to focus on automation pretty heavily. We formed a team around it. We decided this is going to be a first-class citizen. We're doing way too many of these to not actually take this seriously. And then, I mean, Chris over there can probably talk about it in more detail afterwards than I can. But it was a bit of a struggle because we had a process that was working okay, not fantastic, and we knew it needed to get better. And more importantly, we knew we needed something that worked appropriately beyond just scale or deploying to production. So we needed something that specifically actually also deployed to these things that we call tap-in-a-box servers, which are basically our entire stack on a box in AWS that any developer can spin up and run all of their staging and QA on. And they can present to QA people halfway around the world, to partners, whatever the case is. And we wanted it to look and feel exactly like production. But we also wanted to be able to encapsulate everything in a really nice, tight way. So that was why we went down. We used FPM as well. We used Packer for a little more Amy's. You know, it's that sort of stuff that we had to do. But it still took, 12 weeks, I think, start to finish. Yeah, he's shaking his head. So yes, about 3 months, so it wasn't a small project, and that was with a fairly sizable team around it too, 3 or 4 people. So.
We have cloud formation. I have cloud formation templates. At this point, they can actually spin up a copy of dev, a copy of stage, or I actually have the option of using a branch instead. That's an option for the parameters. We can't actually run the whole stack in one box, at least not cheap ones.
Yeah.
So it's like, screw it. I'm not willing to go ahead and do this and say, AWS, it doesn't cost that much to use 3 individual boxes, and then everything doesn't conflict.
Yeah, so we actually, I'm a big evangelist, not literally an evangelist, but I'm a big promoter of Spot instances inside of AWS. So all of our stuff is actually running on Spots. And so we've had at different times, sometimes to my chagrin, I get a little chippy sometimes with the developers, but we've had upwards of 100 different developer boxes running on Spot instances. So we're able to basically have every single developer can have a fairly sizable instance in AWS. We sort of pick and choose the regions depending on how popular they are. We really actually hadn't had any outages up until yesterday morning, and somebody sent out an email, the Spot apocalypse has happened, and we lost all of those nodes. But for the most part, all that stuff is ephemeral anyway. It's spin up, spin down, spin up, spin down. And so we've found that we can mitigate the fact that, we run them on fairly sizable boxes by just running them on Spots and set the bid price relatively low. And so even if it does spike up, you're still not paying the on-demand price. So.
Okay. How do you guys?
Long question. Sorry.
How do you guys handle high availability deploys? Say you want to deploy a new app into production with no downtime at all, or if you deploy an app into production and it's broken, you don't want to have that time when you roll back and put it back in, like that could be minutes, hours, whatever. How do you guys handle that?
So we're a Ruby shop, and so the majority of our things that we're deploying out are sitting on top of Unicorn. So Unicorn has a very nice user2 flag or signal that you can basically pass to it that does an in-place role, and we front that with Nginx, and so it'll basically buffer up the request as it's waiting for it to restart. There's a tiny little window where it would actually fail, and so we use Nginx to make sure that doesn't happen. That, to me though, that's not really HA, that's sort of like on that box. availability. For us, what we think about HA, we run in multiple availability zones. We actually run in 4. Our stack is widely distributed, and we roll things out incrementally across the entire infrastructure. So we're able to pull the wire pretty quick. We also, we actually roll things out, and I'm jumping ahead, but we actually roll things out into an isolated cluster prior to actually launching it wide. So we're able to see actually the performance metrics of the individual box before it actually goes out wide. The latter part, which is rollbacks, are surprisingly hard. It's hard to also get engineers to think about rollbacks. So we tend to do things that rollbacks are not a problem. You never want to find yourself where it's, if we roll back, then things stop working, right? Or we have to roll back a migration to get things working. So it's a lot of just upfront, engineers have to be very smart about it. And then if you have to do a rollback, we have the ability to, instead of rolling out incrementally, we have the ability to basically just do a blast to both servers and say, roll back now. And we keep the old deploy hanging around so we can symlink back over, restart it, but there's still that 45-second window where you actually have to wait for it to reboot. So it's not perfect. We want to do better. We're actually looking into ways to do it better. But so if anybody here is using Unicorn and has figured out how to make it be a little bit faster on deploys, please talk to me afterwards.
I want to take that question from another perspective, because that covered a lot of what I could have said. So if I want to look at it from the data side, on the high level data side. So when you have the whole app layer where you have to handle, okay, you want to try and swap things out quickly. That's where stuff like Unicorn and all stuff is good, and you can front load it with Nginx. But what about on the data side too? For us as an analytics company, you're talking terabytes of data, and you want to make some change to the way you're interacting with that data, or some change to how that data is laid out. You can't do that instantaneously. So you always have to code in basically both the old and new code paths, and then do a rolling deploy. For example, if you wanted to migrate some data to a different database, well, you're essentially going to have to use both databases for a little while. Try and do a consistent operation between the two of them. So it's kind of a feature flag style approach where you deploy with the new and the old, and then we will always bake in some kind of verification into the code itself, where it's doing some checking as to, and we're doing some monitoring and metric counting as to, is it really moving the way we think it is? And then once that verifies, we can basically turn off the old side of the code base, and then eventually remove that code out completely. So that's kind of how we handle HA on the data side of things. Otherwise, on the app side, we couldn't cover it.
Sorry.
You guys have anything on this?
So we were very similar to the other environments. And in Amazon, it was basically fronted by an ELB that hit Nginx nodes, which then hit the app servers. And similarly, we would leave the old artifact around with a symlink. We would pull one arm of the load balancer off at a time and do the rolling kind of upgrade of each process. In terms of rollbacks, it was typically roll forward. At one point, we actually did implement a rollback feature in the deployment tool. That worked great until we rolled back twice and ended up with the bad code.
How do you handle ELB draining?
Well, I'm not at HubSpot anymore, so
I figured I wasn't sure if it was
I'm not sure either.
So you've got connections in flight to an ELB, to a server. You start dropping one of those arms off,
Yeah, so
you're going to lose the connection.
exactly. So
There's
that
no
I mean,
nice
we did
draining
nothing.
feature.
Yeah, we did nothing for that in particular.
Unfortunately, there's no drain.
We did nothing for that, but in terms of the data side, this is also not, we weren't using any, the data patterns are basically, data tools are basically Hadoop, HBase, and MySQL. So for Hadoop, what we were doing is we were basically treating each AZ as a rack. So when we built out topologies for Hadoop, we basically designed them such that data would always be in at least two AZs/racks. On the MySQL side, we weren't doing anything for HA, but we were like a Galera tool or something like that, or multi-master. What we did do is build into Rainmaker the ability to, we would always have at least two replicas in that, well, we'd have a master and then two replicas that lived in different AZs than the master. And built into Rainmaker was basically the functionality that if I lost a master, I would have to do a DNS swap to the replica, promote him to master. But in Amazon, we fully automated it such that we could actually pull backups from our EBS snapshots and rebuild within a matter of minutes. So it was basically like switch over to the slave who's now been promoted, and then backfill another slave.
We're just now getting into some of the HA functionality, basically designing for multi-AZ, and each AZ is basically going to be independent, except sharing the database in the back end. We're in the process of moving, we're currently on RDS, moving away probably from that, just because our devs are using Python, Django with South, and South migrations are different. I'm much more used to people that are doing, actual direct control of their queries instead of ORMs, quite the same way, and so they can manage the roll forwards and migrations and good stacking and things like that much better. If you're not designing your system to be running both versions of your code, you should be separating your migrations, your data migrations from your actual code. Feature flags are God, is the short answer.
That actually brings a question to my mind. So you mentioned RDS. Are you guys using any of the Amazon value add services above?
Tons of them. We use RDS, we use Dynamo, we use SQS, we use Route 53, we use, there's Route 53 missing.
Yeah, it was the same, although, so we use RDS, we use Route 53, we use the ELB, otherwise we tend to do a lot of stuff ourselves. We actually also stay away from EBS. We got spooked by the EBS outage from a couple years ago, and no matter, and no matter the one that took down everything for 2 days. We no matter how many times I go to talk to AWS folks and they tell me no, don't worry, it's fixed now. I go no, but that's what you said the first time, and then no, that's what you said the second time. So if you're not planning for an EBS outage right now, you should go home and think about what you're going to do when that falls over, because it will happen again.
I want to tell a war story on that. One of the interesting things about EBS is that when it does fail, it's in a failure mode that's not common from a storage perspective.
Yes.
And so you get really weird behavior, especially out of databases. If your storage fails, oftentimes, and it's a locally attached hard disk or SSD or something, you're going to get errors from the hardware that are essentially going to cause the operating system at some point to, whether it's using smart or whatever status tracking is doing, it's eventually going to remove that disk if you were, let's say, have it as part of a hardware RAID or software RAID. The problem with EBS is that it will have these kind of in-between failure modes where, and this is what happened in a couple of the outages, where instead of outright failing, the operations start taking a lot longer, like seconds instead of tens of milliseconds, or just hang indefinitely. And that really, that failure caused us to change how we view basically storage in Amazon. And it essentially hung a few of our databases. Our databases didn't really account for that failure mode. So we are using RDS for now. I'm not sure how much value add I actually get out of it other than the multi-AZ functionality they have, which is something nice. I actually am a much bigger fan of just straight MySQL, especially 5.6 with its functionality in terms of HA functionality, which is redesign your entire replication strategy. There you go. Poof. And the global bin models and stuff like that are huge game changers. But we do use our Route 53, which is amazing. I don't know if I can easily build that anytime quickly. ELBs again, and that's pretty much it. We don't do anything other than EBS other than the basic storage on the systems, and I'll probably move away from those fairly soon because I just don't care about systems. Other than the fact that I can actually build AMIs faster with the EBS backed AMIs. Just because I actually wasn't even, from everything I've read about the EBS outages, they were per AZ, right?
There was one though that rippled to multiple
There was
AZs.
multi-AZs?
Yeah. So there were a bunch of people
I
who
know
got.
multi-region for that.
Yeah, there are a bunch of people that got lucky. Actually, Vixmo is one of them. We sort of somehow managed to escape it. We were there's another company in our office at the time that had a lesson, and they got bit by it for like 2 days, and it was brutal. And it was just like it was a roll of the dice, right? Yeah, it's rough. I don't even trust really to even have my root volumes be sitting on top of EBS because once they have to start actually eventually you're logging something to var log, and if you haven't changed that over to instance store, then eventually it's going to back up and it's just going to stop working. So you are officially forewarned. Yeah, it's a little scary. Fortunately, Amazon seems to be backing off of forcing new instance types onto EBS. In fact, they also just changed the M3 instance types sort of without telling anybody that it's no longer EBS only. They actually just added SSDs to it, which is nice. So instance store is the way to go. And your data should be getting replicated. Don't rely on EBS snapshots. We're getting away from deployment, sorry, but it's definitely. So on the topic of deployment, so everybody here is doing in-place deployments, right? Yeah.
For now.
Yeah, it's interesting because Amazon they stand up an entirely brand new stack.
As is Netflix.
As is Netflix.
And Asgard actually is open source for doing this stuff. Right? They actually build out new ELBs. Sorry, new clusters. And attach them with a new ELB. Swap the ELB in.
Oh, wow.
So they also cut new ones.
Correct, but they actually use ELBs to do their deploy. They actually are swapping applications in new versions of the application at the ELB level. So it's just a DNS update. Poof, it's in, they test it, then you roll back, they just bring back the other one. They don't actually decommission the old ELBs and instances, they just drop them back out.
I just couldn't justify the cost. I don't know what it was with you guys, but it was just I couldn't bear to tear down that many servers all at once that were near the end of their hour. It was just like if we do that 5 times a day or 6 times a day, I may cycle through 100 plus servers 3 times in an hour. That's just brutal.
How often are you guys doing deploys? Actually, it's an interesting question.
Depends on the day. Today I did 8. Some days we do 1. I think it honestly depends. We do gated releases, so it's not continuous. It's not automated continuous.
Yeah, it depends on our project, but for the front end, we're doing a lot a day. For more of the data backing stuff, not quite as many, but because a lot of that stuff is nice and flux.
I had a quick question about that hourly thing. That's for your spot businesses, right?
No, on-demand is also hourly.
So, but you wouldn't have any, because on-demand because reservations can switch between instances. If you were doing that stand-up and you use reserved instances, you wouldn't get hit with those like partial.
But do they not care?
It depends on the kind of reserve. So some reserve you're just, I think in the heaviest reservation, right, there's no more hourly fees, you just pretty much pay it outright.
Right, you paid up front.
But anytime you have an hourly fee associated with a reservation or on demand, if you start that server even for a minute, you're going to get charged for the whole hour.
So actually, this is something I didn't know. So if I have a heavy reservation, I can stand up and stand down a server at the same time, or without.
Oh, that's a good question. Like, what if you
I don't think so.
stop
Right?
one?
Yeah, they're gonna bill me for that hour.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The other thing to know about heavy, which is kind of funny, is that you do have a monthly bill you get for the heavy.
Right.
It's just whether you use whether you're using or not, you get covered.
Yeah.
It's not just the Root Plus, but it's also
Right.
Yeah.
They're like, you should be using it, whether or not you did. So you're right.
So yeah. In terms of deploys. That was the question. Deploys. My last office, we were doing 30 sometimes a day. Now I'm actually in a shop that had started doing 8 deploys and has actually backed far off that into once a week. Based on not wanting to have to mess up financial services are cranky people, especially hedge funds and big shops. They get cranky when things break in the middle of the week. They don't like it.
You break it on Friday night though when they're all out drinking. It's fine.
They don't care about that. But yeah, so we actually have everything constantly deployed to the stage, and then we're sometimes even demoing off of our staging environments.
Can I ask about slugs? So slugs, when I first heard about them, they seemed really cool because I come from a Java background.
You like your war. You
You
got
package your war, you drop it in place, and life is good. You can move move on. Like,
Never gone wrong.
coming to the Ruby world where there's all these pieces of infrastructure interacting together, gem servers, and like it seemed kind of crazy to me. Like, what were the things that brought you to using slugs, and what were some of the challenges and the pros and cons of using your deploy process?
So it was really about distributing around consistent code, always knowing exactly what you have, right? It's always a pristine copy. So there's no Git history living in there. There's no, part of our deploy process is not Git pull, right? We're actually not relying on GitHub at that point either. So because we do have code up in GitHub. So honestly, I think it comes down to it's really nice to have that atomic bundle that gets passed around and that you can basically take and put somewhere wherever you want. It's also useful because we're able to basically pre-generate a bunch of stuff that you might normally be running on an individual server that you don't want to actually have to do it. So Jenkins is a perfect example of saying, like, here's 10 commands that we can run on our package that we would normally be running on 100 different servers. We're going to run it once on one, distribute it out to everybody. And so when you talk about a slug, I mean, you can think about a slug as a tarball, right? There are better tools than just tarballing your code. FPM, which is what we're also using.
What does the slug include?
For us, it includes basically the entirety of the code base, and then a bunch of pre-computed potential values in there. So, like assets, you may be pre-compiling assets and putting them on a box.
So you're not going so far as like this new Linux container approach to Docker approach where you're containing system libraries, usual libraries.
Yeah, no. Right now we use Packer to pre-bake the AMIs that have all the appropriate packages on them. So for us, and that's a good point. So let's say we're deploying out a change to our actual system environment, right? Which we actually treat the same way as a normal deploy. That's actually an example of where we'll package a new AMI, we'll build it out, that we can then put a slug onto, and then when we're rolling that out, we'll actually stand up a brand new auto-scaling group, and then we'll slowly stand him up and then stand down the old one once they're side by side. And that's how we do the system level upgrades. One of the things that we've been talking about doing is doing the Docker style deployment, where now we're getting up another abstraction layer, and now we're saying, okay, we want to actually be able to deploy out package changes and library changes to all of our servers without actually having to stand up new instances.
Which gets around that hourly.
Right, it does. Yeah.
Do slugs include all the gems required for that software to run also?
It does. We vendor cache all of our gems,
Uh-huh.
so we're able to basically bundle everything into it. So there's no it speeds up that particular step because you're not repeating it. So in aggregate, you still have to do it, right, at some point. But for us, we run our servers really hot. We try and run them basically as close to the edge as we can, such that if we lose the entire AZ, we still have enough capacity left over to serve all of our traffic, but just barely, right? In fact, we're probably going to run a slightly degraded state where we're going to be a little bit slower. So one of the things that is a side effect of that is that Ruby is just god-awful slow in terms of how much CPU it wants to eat up. So when you're actually running a deploy, you can actually spike your CPU. And so the less time that you're doing that, the more responsive all of your app servers are as you're rolling.
Okay, so it seems like you guys have pretty fleshed out deployment solutions, the different pipelines. And I know you didn't just think of it some night and then come out with it. Do you have any particular techniques or tools that ended up being dead ends for you, or can you just talk about that a little bit? Or you did just
No, actually, we
Again, there's a lot of dead ends in the not in the deployment space. Pretty much, I mean, everything that we use, like, I have complaints about everything that we use at some point, right? I mean, Chef is great, and Capistrano works great, and Jenkins works great, but there's always like caveats there. There's a really good presentation out of Twitter or something recently about some of the cons of using Chef, and cruft builds up over time, and then it's hard to kind of remove it. So I don't know if that's a reflection of the tool or how we're managing the tool or what, but yeah, a loose answer to that question.
Anybody else want to field that?
I've never made a mistake once.
Yeah.
Let me know how that goes.
I mean, we're investing, we're not yet building packages of the code and pushing that out at the same time, but we've started doing this thing with Packer and actually pushing the virtual ends into the AMI, in addition to some of the other things. But that's the one that really is kind of a toss-up. I'm not sure if I like. The reason I did it is because even deploying it out of S3, it's a 50 meg tarball compared to
Only 50 megs. Good on you.
well,
Yeah,
when it's compressed,
Yeah.
compressed everything else.
Yeah.
It's coming right out of out of dev package at that point. But 50 megs, pulling that from S3 sometimes can be unreliable. It's unreliable how fast that can be sometimes. That can be, a minute. Well, I think I just got my web servers and auto scaling down to under about 60 seconds of a Puppet run, and that in addition to at least a minute before, from the trigger. It's probably 2 to 3 minutes from the trigger through the build to running and serving traffic, plus a little more because of the auto scale health checks. That's not that fast. I'd really like it to be faster.
Yeah. That's usually our biggest complaint too. Is boy, I wish it was faster. Like I wish Jenkins built it faster.
Well, I'm sure Jenkins.
Oh, yeah.
I actually have time to waste there. It's the I need more capacity. How fast can I get more web servers up? And how quickly? I've got like a 300-second timeouts on health. On auto scaling changes right now.
But
Do I really want to go higher than that just because my damn web servers don't come up that fast?
So you said like 2 to 3 minute Puppet run. So you bake most of the stuff into the AMI.
So right now I bake in Puppet, I bake in on my web servers, Nginx, the entire virtual end, and mCollective. In addition to the libraries for MySQL and for Memcache, which gives me most of what I want and does it fairly well.
So we were the opposite. We were like, it was literally,
It's at 60 seconds for Puppet.
yeah,
It's
we
3
were like,
minutes total.
yeah, we were like 15.
Well, that's the problem. I went from a 20 minute. I actually saw it take 20 minutes at one time. Like, okay, I can't do this.
The best one is when your server only has 1 or 2 CPUs on it, and then all of a sudden, for us, it's Chef. Our Chef runs are now eating up all the CPU on the box, and you're like, thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Chef.
I'm using them on mediums right now, so I don't have that much CPU
Yeah.
to be playing with here.
Well, so we were like just literally straight like, so we were CentOS 6.3, like CentOS 6.3, cloud init, and that's it. Like everything else is backed on.
So 6.4 has it built in.
Yeah.
Cloud.
Actually, so we had a whole bunch of changes that we needed that we pushed up to cloud init, and that's why we had to like actually build in language that we wanted because it wasn't impacted yet. But
Cloud init, by the way, is awesome. For those of you that don't know it.
cloud init is awesome until it's not awesome.
Yes, and the way to fix it and the way to work with it is to not look at the documentation.
Don't look at the
Docs
documentation,
are
and
not
don't-
helpful.
certainly do not look at the code.
exist.
No, the code is better than the documentation. At least the code's there.
Yes.
There's also almost always someone in the actual IRC room, which is a big help.
So I guess I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you as a Python shop if you've investigated the wheel package format at all yet. It's a newer package format for Python that my understanding is that it lets you actually install into a virtual end locally, and then the wheel archive will package up the virtual end with all the dependencies as they're installed and let you deploy that directly to the server without having to do all the build steps of the individual Python packages at deploy time.
So I'm not actually having that problem, thankfully. So I basically kind of built myself around that by virtue of I have the Jenkins box, I have a requirements.txt change come in, I detect it by doing the pip, checking to see whether it's an add or remove. I rebuild my actual virtual end, and then at that point tar up the virtual end. It does all the compile. We're using SciPy and NumPy and all this other stuff. And honestly, whoever built their dependency system is insanely painful because great, SciPy wants to install the stats model, and then they don't. It has a requirement, but they can't actually be installed simultaneously. You have to manually install one first, and then do an install of the whole package.
Oh, I know.
I'm new to Python and working with it. I'm used to PHP and Ruby and a bunch of other things, so it's like, really? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
But we ended up tarring up the virtual end, using FPM on it, and actually distribute that directly out as a deb, and that just drops on the machine. Because I'm using the same AMIs with the same types and stuff like that, it makes no difference to me. So it's boom, done. I'm not.
So we use a similar approach, but instead of tarring the whole virtual end, we have a server which has mirrors in the virtual end for every commit issue. particular branch we're running, and we use rsync to copy over just what's changed. So instead of having to copy over 50 meg, you only have to copy over the new packages.
Right.
A lot faster.
I didn't want to have, the problem I had was, yes, it's faster. I thought of it. I liked that idea. The problem was that I had to worry about having all the systems talk to one central system, which is a dependency in AWS I actually was afraid of. You know, that's one box or one, maybe if I did it one per AZ, I might be a little bit more comfortable, but boxes go AWOL when in AWS kind of random.
And network
sometimes.
partitions happen all the time.
Yeah, so I'm kind of, by putting it in S3, I'm actually slightly better off.
And they're doing multi-region for S3. If you're in USC standard, it's actually replicated to the West Coast and the East Coast. So, in pretty good shape.
So because of that, I can at least, rely on those packages being there even in the event of an oh shit moment. And, I've lost the whole AZ. Okay, I'm adding a whole bunch of capacity now someplace else. It'll hopefully work.
One of the things that we've talked about to try and speed up that stuff is
Something to work on though for us.
yeah, we thought about splitting the file up into like 100 smaller parts because I don't think S3 is going to throttle us. I think they're going to throttle you per file. They're not going to throttle you across all the files, right? So I could be wrong about that.
No,
But
we haven't looked at this. This is an optimization that we have not done.
yeah, for us, I think our package is over 200 meg. So for us, download speeds are a problem, and S3
Huge.
definitely throttles.
Each slug is 200 meg?
It's a beefy package.
So you brought up,
Did anyone of you look into the ability of S3 to also serve torrent files for distributing to a lot of servers?
Yes, we have talked about doing torrents. Yeah. I didn't know that it natively does torrents now.
That's
Yeah,
good.
it does.
It does. That's good.
Yeah, basically, I think you just add like extend or add like a field parameter and it returns the torrent file and seeds it for you as a web seed. And all the servers that download it will then also
Right.
with that.
That's right. I will put that on my never note.
I'm definitely looking to improve what we're doing, to be honest. The reason we went with S3 is because I've got a push. There's a package, a Python package, I think dev-s3, which allows you to go ahead and push up a Debian repo, and therefore I can actually check, and it just serves it straight out of S3. It doesn't have, you don't actually install anything on the Ubuntu box. It's just a standard repo. So it's not like the one that actually, it's not the actual one for apt S3, which requires an extension on the machine. No, it's just a clean HTTP repo.
So you say again how you set up the S3 app repo without that quality?
So you just use, there's a thing called dev-s3, but it's not quite perfect if I remember correctly. Unfortunately, it's not like the repos where you run the create repo and it's done and that's the end of it. No, it's not quite that easy. We did have to actually use rep repo, I think, a little bit first to go ahead and build the local one. But then dev-s3 was, once I got the right file up, I think it was the sources or something wasn't quite right. But it does handle itself pretty nicely though. So,
we are recording this, and I'll go through and make an outline of different tools and stuff later, so you don't have to write them all. You talked about documentation, and I think we answered the last question. So I work upstairs, and we have an infrastructure folder in our GitHub repo with full of markdown documents, and it just keeps growing every week because the systems are so complicated. You guys have any tips or tricks of how to spread some of that knowledge across the teams? You don't just have that one guy.
That's actually, so there was a gigantic internal thread over this on this very topic, but where everyone was coming at it from a different angle. And I think something that we kind of arrived at was that ultimately it shouldn't, if you're relying on documentation and big README files and checklists about whether it's concerning like how onboarding a new developer and getting all the stuff to run on their machine, or how do you actually deploy a specific kind of server, that stuff will get stale or people will skip steps. For instance, if you have in order to make a front-end web server production, these are the things you need to do, and then somewhere in the middle there is you need to test by running this and this. Someone's like going to skip that test phase and be like, well, I don't really need to do that, and they'll just skip over it, right? So you kind of get around this by eventually you get to a point where you start thinking about tooling. How do you make the whole thing seamless? How do you make it so that when a new developer comes on board, they sit down at the laptop, they run, they go to type in one command, hit enter, and then wait, and then everything's there. And then it's even better if you can make that process be the same process as essentially deploying to your actual real servers. And they can, again, just run one command and then have it happen. That's why you see a lot of people popping up with their own front ends, where you can go to some website that kind of repackages a lot of stuff where you use a developer and say, new web server from this branch, go. So I think the only way to combat that is to just make everything easier through code itself.
So, two sides. One, the front end, even though, yeah, you could go to the AWS console, or you could go directly to Jenkins and run the things with the parameters. Jenkins is a good starting point for that kind of thing. At least it means that they just type in the branch name as a parameter. When they hit, build with parameter, type of branch name, poof, and that's a good starting point. It's not as nice as a full custom dashboard, but at least it's the same thing every single time. It's really nice. The other thing from the systems, from our side of the world, from my side of the world, that's what the code's for, and that's why we have comments in it. And at least it's the same way, at least I can read and see what the hell it's doing. What is this machine? Well, it has mclappy on it, it's got a web server, and it's got this on it.
Well, I'm thinking about the case where you could read the public code, but that's just covering the configuration of the server.
Right.
It's not really covering any of the deployment pipeline. And so I've been in teams where the guy that did that left, and then you just have a bunch of developers left who don't know how to maintain their deployment system anymore.
So our deployment tool, we've written a custom tool, is a Ruby gem. It's basically a CLI for actually running deploys, which is then going to eventually get translated into a fairly simple UI that you can interact with. Is very heavily documented, and it's extremely well written. We are very fortunate that we have one engineer who actually likes to write documentation, or at least he's very good at it, and which they are very hard to find, by the way. Engineers who write documentation are unicorns. So when you find them, you capture them, and then you don't let them go. And so, I mean, for a system like that, where where that's important, you document it, and then it's also it's the K equals 3 rule. You got to find anytime you have important information that you need to make sure it's distributed, 3 people got to know it, because it's easy for one person to disappear, and it's easy for 2 people to disagree. And so, if you choose 3, then you're better off.
We're planning dirt tests, by the way. Probably hopefully once a quarter, where basically as I'm the only operations person. I'm pretty sure right now I'm going to be hit by a bus right off the bat.
In fact, you've been getting called for the last hour. So.
You have to take that.
Well, that's what it home.
Double.
The only thing I would say to that too is, I mean, this should go as no surprise. Be no surprise to anybody. Is just co-locate the documentation with your code, so that when people are grabbing through, like I changed this particular feature, I can, it will show up in the readme.md. I've had this debate with countless people who I want to use Confluence or I want to use a wiki.
Put it in an external wiki that somebody needs to know the login for.
With GitHub pages,
And know that's there.
if you want to make it look pretty, you can do that already. It's a disconnect between what's actually going on in the source and some other document.
Sorry.
For me, that just doesn't work.
Yeah. One thing we're finding, this is playing off the comment that you made, is that oftentimes when you're asking people to get involved in this process, no matter what you're using for a deployment tool or what you're using for like a server infrastructure tool, it's actually, so we're trying to get more and more people involved in the code base of those to actually add stuff there when you have a problem. But something that I've found is, especially on the junior developer side, a lot of people have a hard time onboarding with things like Chef, for instance. Like, Chef is a really hard tool to get because it's so open-ended and there's so many ways to go. Everyone has their own way of doing it, and for someone that even for someone that knows Chef to come on board to your Chef kind of environment, like it's still going to take them time to be like, wait, what? How do you guys use this exactly? And then for a junior person, it's just like I have no idea. They aren't even necessarily aware of what it means to do server infrastructure automation, to do like deployment automation. These guys are coming maybe straight out of college. All they know how to do is code, right? And then throwing them at a chef repo is like, it's going to take them weeks to figure out what the heck that is. So you really have to spend a lot of time crafting, like readings in the code, and then rolling it up into very packaged tools. Like we wrote a little command line utility that instead of having to know all the chef stuff, you just kind of say, I want this server, and then it just takes care of the rest. I think that's something I didn't anticipate. One of the big regrets I had was Chef is actually really hard to onboard and develop. It's surprisingly hard as compared to what I thought.
Funny, I think that you can replace Chef with basically every DevOps tool, and then your problems are just compounded.
Honestly, I haven't seen as much trouble with Puppet. I've actually given devs commit to our, my last job. We actually had devs that were committing changes to ERBs for comp files without a problem. It's like, yeah, here you go.
People do like minor comp changes aren't so bad, but there's especially when they don't know operation stuff, like they don't know what means to install a Linux package. Like if we're running on Ubuntu and someone doesn't even know what apt is, like that's how junior they are, then they're not going to know what it means necessarily to install a package at all.
Especially when it comes to Puppet and like dependency management, like this has to happen before this, or I change this file that notifies this service. Like that, I found that that's also something.
So they're actually making that a lot better with 3.4. They actually have in-order processing now as an option, which is really nice. It's just like every touchdown.
Don't get me started.
I was going to make a suggestion there, at least I was working in the past, was to have kind of a well-maintained toy server configurations, or would have a Java file where it's like a hello world, basically app, and there's like plus the configuration, so it's like as bare bones as possible. Like this is how you basically app running, because like you find that like every single other app has like every single knob and one return, and it was really helpful to have like well-defined like here's the as we know as possible.
I think that's a really good suggestion because, in my experience anyway, people coming from the system side of it, writing Chef stuff, they might not do their tests or they might not make their code dry. And people coming from the dev side of it might not know that, hey, I could just use this one tool instead of trying to pipe 6 tools together. Stuff like that. So having an example would be really helpful.
So to make sure I understand that right, are you saying basically provide a vanilla like environment already pre-made, or are you saying provide instructions to the
No, more like say like you create like I said this where you had servers that had different server types. Like there's like Java server type and a like Python server type that was running those kind of instances, and having one that just is like you get different Puppet scripts that would configure them differently, and one that would just be like here's like as vanilla the Java server as possible, and have like a project you could run on it. And literally all that project did was like run hello world, so somebody could see like probably don't want to see a POM file again in my life, but like as vanilla as possible, like what the POM file of something that could run into the system would be, and then they compare the other projects to see how they were tuned on top of that.
So it's interesting. This sort of begs the question of what we're talking about. Junior engineers or engineers in general just don't know how to do a lot of this stuff, and from my perspective, being a fairly young engineer, Heroku's been around for a while now, and it's been around long enough where I think a lot of people have just gotten used to the fact that, hey, there's a CLI, and I define a proc file, and here you go, and it just sort of works, at least on Ruby. And I think that's only going to end up getting worse, right? As more people no longer are actually tinkering with their own servers and are no longer spinning up their own VMs, it's not to say that Heroku is going to put DevOps out of business. I think it's actually quite the opposite. It's just going to create a more scarcity in the market because fewer people are actually going to get involved in it.
I don't know, I agree with you there, actually. I think that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I was trying to learn systems at the time. The only way you could learn running multiple systems was to actually have 5 systems. 20 years ago. No VM. VMs were pretty much non-existent.
5 workstations from 5 different vendors running their own 5 different versions.
Maybe not. But if you were lucky, you had the only way to run a network of 10 systems with talking to a DNS server that actually mattered was to actually have 10 systems. You can now have, for the capital investment of $1, run 20 servers. Yeah, they're T1 micros, but they're still 20 different instances that actually all talk to a central system, and you have to figure out, you can actually learn and do things with that kind of stuff.
Well, sure,
but
what's the incentive if I can just push a button in Heroku and
or app
Exactly.
or Google app.
Google
I think
App
we're all
Engine.
getting around the same thing, is that as we provide more abstractions to different members of the team, it gets harder to ship.
Walk into any dev room in Boston and ask the dev team what mallet and Frio. I mean, you probably get less than half of the developers.
As long as you didn't walk into a C++
Yeah,
shop.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about abstraction. I commonly joke that it's not computer science; it's just abstraction.
Yep.
It's abstraction science.
We've even hired people who were really stellar developers, but they like pretty much refused to work at the system. And they were like, I'm not installing packages. That's not what I do. I don't know about any of that stuff. And we made that trade-off. But okay, and not as in the sense, not even in the sense of saying that like, oh, I don't know it, but I'm willing to learn. Like I've had people say outright, like, I'm not going to do that.
I think people, before all of these tools came about the past 10 years or so, I think people got bit by things a lot and they say, hey, I'm never going to do that again. Even though there is this tool now to give you better testing, better abstractions over it, you're still feeling that fight. Speaking of testing, okay, so I know how we test our deployment pipeline right now. We go to the DNS link and see if it works, and we need to expand on that. But it's kind of nebulous. Like you go to a blog post about deployment, and they'll talk about the pipeline a little bit. They'll give you some good starters for it, but there's usually nothing about testing.
So something that just happened that helps the whole world learn from the chef community is the test kitchen now allows for shell provision. It's big because now you can actually run Puppet code from test kitchen.
So with Test Kitchen, you're just testing your config management though, which really,
So
well,
you
maybe
so
should
you can also do integration level tests there as well.
yeah, but I guess you could test
that's
your
one.
deployment pipeline
Separately is also, you deploy systems and have test instances come up, run the actual or server spec or something like that. You can actually, I've actually seen some things recently on integrating into Packer builds server spec runs. One of the last things that happens is it just runs a server spec test. It's that, if you're building an AMI and does it have does it have everything it's supposed to have as part of the actual server spec test at the end, and can you connect to the MySQL and things like that? Poof, you've now actually verified that the AMI is actually good. If it fails the server spec test, it's going to stop. Packer's going to say, nope, don't deploy. It's not going to build the AMI.
What about posting environments? Now you want to deploy code.
Well, just saying, server spec, things like that, running out of, I did a talk last year at Public Camp in New York, and on probably didn't writing up the whole thing, but on moving tests beyond just the local or even just linting and RSpec, Puppet, and things like that into the next level where the real problem is, which is the integration testing. And how do you go ahead and go past those stages?
We actually do integration testing through Jenkins, where we will. So our kind of the pipeline and a little more granular is, if you deploy to specific branches, Jenkins will pick it up and then build it, run unit tests, which is pretty much mostly a local thing. And then if those unit tests pass, it pushes it to a staging server. And then when that is deployed, then integration tests start running. So now you're actually looking at whether or not the deployment itself worked. But some of the things I would like to see improved there for us is that this is still pushing to a staging server, and you're checking that the staging server is good, but there may be something specific, like tiny little thing different on that staging server that you can catch that's not that way on production, right? So it'd be even better, I think, and a lot of people do this, even better to push to kind of a staging server, test it, and then promote that staging server to a real server somehow, maybe by swapping the config or something like that. And then you swap in the config and you put it into the actual real pool, and now you have a server that went through the full integration test and actually made it to production. That's one thing we're not doing, which I would like to do. And then also gives you a rolling deployment tile where every time you're bringing up a server, you're kind of running integration tests against it.
Yeah, I guess I haven't found too frequently that, and maybe I'm just wrong, for us running an integration test on a box prior to bringing it in, has been useful for for us. I guess there's probably a scenario.
It depends upon
Yeah.
what the integration tests do, right? Like if
Do.
you have a complex environment with services that depend upon each other and need to have ports be open and security groups be set and the right things be listening on the other end, those kinds of integration tests can be huge.
Yeah,
We need more of those.
For us, we part of our deployment process is an isolated deploy where we're rolling out to a small percentage of our boxes. We use New Relic really heavily internally. All of our servers are instrumented, so we have error alert levels. We can actually watch the performance on the box for a little while to see how it performed before and after the tests, or before and after the deploys. You just run the problem of you're effectively testing in production, which is also never ideal, especially if that's working.
So first of all, New Relic's interesting. How do you guys afford to run New Relic on all your quad boxes? Because it's a fortune.
You can negotiate it.
There's a-
yeah, you're right.
yeah.
It is a fortune. Yeah.
One thing I'd seen, and I know we paid for 10 boxes, there's a major difference in price if you buy 10. Huge. But we actually found that, I've just been looking around lately, things like stream level metrics. There's some wrappers for metrics. If you instrument your system correctly, either the metrics library or some of the other names of those tools, and then attach that to like a log stash or like Lineman, pulling it into Lineman, you can actually get most of what New Relic is doing, pretty much all of it. You'll end up building it out yourself.
Yeah,
And it cuts all that cost down.
So yes, you can
That was
negotiate.
graphite.
Yeah. Well, stop using graphite. Anybody who likes graphite.
Yeah, what, graphite the web UI or graphite the actual data set?
Graphite UI.
Okay.
Yeah.
The UI, there's multiple other front ends.
I'll just say this out there. Librato, if you're not using it, you should go check it out. They're great. Stats D8 compatible API, just using their. Yeah, Librato is fantastic. The founders are great.
It's pretty good, yeah.
For us, New Relic is a tool that is worth every dime that we pay for it. And yes, you can negotiate it down in price, but you have to ask yourself. You have to ask yourself a question. For us, we generate a lot of revenue, and so I can make the trade-off of if I pay New Relic X amount of dollars per month, am I going to save myself a potential outage that costs me that equivalent amount per month? And the answer is unbelievably 100% yes, every single month. And so.
Can you give us examples of outages that you?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that New Relic is fantastic about is when you're looking after a post-deploy and you're interacting on our scale where we're doing, at different times of day, we're doing well over 2 million requests per minute are flowing through our system, right? And so you can make a very, very subtle change to how you interact with the backend system that can totally change performance metrics of your cluster, right? So you may be provisioning under the assumption that you're doing 7 requests off to a backend server to ask some piece of information. A developer goes in and makes a change that seems to be innocuous, and all of a sudden they're making 3 separate requests to that box, right? So when you go and actually look at the performance metrics change on that individual instance, on that physical instance that you actually deploy to, you can see, oh my gosh, that time that I'm interacting with that server bumped up so much that if I deployed this out wide, I would fall over because my server was really
How do you guys do that? Because we use New Relic too, and there's different approaches that you can use within New Relic to do that.
Yeah.
So which approach do you use?
in terms of detecting it before and after.
Yeah, are you essentially just going into that newly deployed server and then looking at a specific graph, or do you have an alert on that, alert you for anything, or what?
Yeah, so we have 2 different ways. So in terms of New Relic, a lot of it's honestly I find that eyeballing it actually is quite effective because their aggregates are quite good.
Yep.
Especially if you know the deploy change that you're rolling out, you know to go and check that control level, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do is we actually post in FlowDoc the instance that's rolling out. They can actually pull up the New Relic API for that instance, and they can look at that instance and eyeball it. The other thing that we do is we also use Sensu internally for a lot of our monitoring, and so that does have the aggregate sort of checks where you could actually see on an individual server, oh, my interactions now are drastically different. Assuming we're instrumenting that particular interaction, and it's aggregating the data out. But for the most part, it's as simple as pulling up New Relic, going to the database tab, and so we instrumented React, for example, in our database tab, and you can see it bump up by 2x, or you can even see it bump up to subtle amounts, but it changes the latency pattern, or whatever the case is.
So are you running on every prod server or just that isolated cluster?
Every prod server. Every prod server. And so you can make the argument that you only really need it on a sample and then the one. And that's probably fair. I just, to be perfectly honest, I find it to be remarkably useful to have it on all boxes. You aren't trying to do mental math in your head of what is actually the request rate that's going to a particular different type, and
I was just curious. Just wanted to
yeah,
double check.
yeah, it's at Vixml we sampled, at Taptroid it's a broad-based solution, and I also like the system monitoring has been progressively getting better, and so it's actually useful to see the before and after CPU metrics getting mapped into that same dashboard, because I can present that dashboard to an engineer, I can show them how to interact with it, and I can be like, here are the things that you should look for after a deploy. Whereas if I tell them, okay, you're going to check New Relic, you're going to check Librado, you're going to check our StatC dashboard, you're going to check, right, if they have a 5-site checklist that they have to walk through, yeah. It's not.
And the plugins they have are really nice too.
Yeah, you know what? Admittedly, we haven't started really heavily playing around with them, but from what we've heard from a lot of people, they're very happy with it. And it's really extensible. So for Ruby, their agent is so easy to basically modify and work with that you can instrument anything you want in kind of custom way.
Whizzing and answer mix is pretty nice. New Relic.
Yep. I didn't realize this was going to turn into an I Love New Relic session, but
I
I'll make sure to let my rep know. Maybe he'll give me a discount next time we negotiate.
You have good proof.
Yeah.
That seems like when we're talking about deployments, the line between testing and monitoring is pretty blurry. Like, it seems like there's almost, you were talking about reactive and proactive before. I would say that unless you're doing canary deployments, the monitoring is kind of reactive. Whereas
So I actually, in my last office, did do canaries and had a couple of stages of even for config management changes. This wasn't even general code-based changes. This was only for Puppet changes. We were doing a fairly extensive set of canaries.
Okay, I think we have one more question from me, and then you guys can ask whatever questions you want. So let's say I get a new job or move somewhere, and the place I go to has nothing. What's the easiest place to get started doing some of this deployment stuff? Or what places should you, if you can't answer that, what places should you avoid doing at the very start?
So my general philosophy is, be influenced by others, but typically systems have to be, everything is different, right? The general thing that I try and tell people is if you come in and it's just a mess, like if it's literally just a mess, then that's one thing. If they have nothing, if they're hand-rolling boxes one by one, then honestly, I would say keep it simple. For Ruby, Capistrano, like it's just dead simple to use. It's actually very good at what it does. It's a good place to start. Avoid doing too much really right off the bat homegrown stuff because you'll go down a rabbit hole and then everything becomes this very custom homegrown. Steal and borrow from other tools if you do go down that road. Eventually you get to a size where you have to, like we have. But on day one, everything, your emphasis should always be on keeping it simple. Can other people quickly understand what I'm doing? Is this really easily understood in a pull request? Can I introduce it? Can I show this to another engineer in an hour or two? And so I guess, and then going and looking around. Take a look at what Heroku puts out there. Take a look at what Netflix puts out there. Take a look at what the other big players have gone to over time. But don't necessarily feel like you have to be there on day one. Feel like that should be kind of your end goal that you're focusing on. But keep it simple as you can along the way.
I think you also have to think about the people in this too. When you're starting out from scratch, you have to say not only what processes are we using on for deploying the code, but what mentality do I want to ingrain in everyone going forward? Like, what's the if you're using Ruby and Capistrano, like get that stuff in there with the code, get people thinking about it and updating it, get people treating it as just like as a first class citizen. Like get that cultural element going, and then have people treat it just like they treat all the rest of the source code. Like there should be some version control around it. There should be kind of a checks, like a code review kind of system around it. Code reviewing the app code review the on the deployment code too. Just look at everything. I would say the first thing, if you're coming into a clean spot or a mess, first thing is have some way of guaranteeing your systems are the same. So some sort of a version control of your B
configuration management system. That's one. Second thing is you should be looking at Jenkins. It's an easy way right now. It's good. And then from there, then it depends on which environment. You probably want to be using some sort of either Python or Ruby. You probably want to be using some sort of system that abstracts you away from the OS packages, be it RBEN, RVM, virtualenv for Python, or whatever else you're using. If you're using the system packages for your actual application code, you will probably regret it at some point because they are not updating. And anything that's a server class OS, they are not updating these things at all fast enough for what your developers are going to ask. They're not going to have the new versions of the APIs. They're not going to have new versions of So those are a couple of things that I found that are really good starting points. And then you can figure out how to actually do, hell, Git pulls don't suck. They work really well, and everyone understands them off the bat.
They work great until you're getting for your well. Yeah.
But for the
Yeah.
first couple of for the
Absolutely.
first little while,
Yeah.
they will work. They're easy. They all understand. Everyone understands it because they're already doing it on their desktop. No one should be changing files on the server. That's another thing.
Unless it's me. Then it's I know what I'm doing now.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the point is, if you're changing files manually on the server, it should be for on one test.
Cowboy hats.
Well, it's
on.
one test box that's going to go feed back into your version control in some way, in the code or infrastructure.
There needs to be some communication around that because you can't just kill a server because someone modified it. Like there has to be communication about different expectations when you're taking.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who's supposed to work on it.
Yes. I agree with all that. I think you guys actually stole most of my points. The other points, well, actually, Dustin, you brought up a great point. I think, especially if you're in the cloud, there has to be an expectation that everything does go away. So, my one biggest suggestion is that build everything ephemeral. You cannot rebuild it from source. If you're doing one-offs, you're doing it wrong. With regard to culture, one of the biggest cultural problems that I've seen is reaction to monitoring. So, if you build a monitoring system that people are not reacting to, you've built it wrong. And if there are checks in there that are going off that no one is like, they wake up at 4 a.m., they look at it, and they go back to sleep, get rid of the check. It doesn't matter if the disk is going to be full in 5 minutes. If no one's reacting to it, it's useless and it builds a little fatigue. So be super, super anal about making sure that your checks mean something and that someone is jumping when they get that check.
It's actually really hard.
It is.
That is really hard.
We
But
were
if
having
you
this conversation earlier today.
But the thing is,
Yeah.
if you do it wrong if you build enough alert fatigue, then it will never be right.
Yeah.
It's like almost a full-time job making sure that alerts get reacted to.
It's one of the main selling points for Stacktrack, right? That they do adaptive alerts and not just 80 to 90. It's 85 on Tuesday, and then we'll see how it's doing, and then 87 on Thursday.
Stacktrack is another good example.
Yeah.
So, it makes me think of scale. I know some of the people over there, and it harkens back to what we were talking about with New Relic, where New Relic is too expensive. Maybe someone would say Stacktrack is too expensive. That depends on the size, the scale of your environment. If you're small enough, scale means different. Depending on what your scale is, your solution is going to be proportionate to what your scale is. So if you have a bash script that stands up your 5 servers, that's perfectly fine as long as you can rebuild it from the source. When you start getting into 100, I'd start saying, okay, well, maybe it's time for a chef or a puppet or some kind of orchestration tool. And then when you get to over 1,000, thinking about, one example I think of is we were using Fabric for a lot of things. Fabric, when you get to 1,000 plus hosts, doesn't really scale. So now you have to start thinking about something else. So I think your problems will scale with time, and you don't have to hit the home run the first go around.
So upstairs we are a very small company, and we are pretty much on the free tier of everything. We have maybe 25 servers up, but we have Chef, New Relic, all this stuff. We use the free tier for now because it works, and we didn't have to have anybody stand anything up. So I guess we're just deferring that decision until we have more information on what our system actually is.
Be agile. Don't be afraid to change.
Yeah.
but when you change, make sure other people agree with the decision to change. Yeah, it's you have to treat your infrastructure the same way you treat your code, and not be afraid to, recognize when you have a deficiency and go after it, right? And but also being cognizant enough to be aware of not being afraid to recognize your deficiencies, and not feel like you're hamstrung on well, we spent the last 3 months building this monitoring system. Sometimes you have to be able to be like, after 3 months of work, being like, yeah, well, it's still not there yet, and as much as you want it to be, we gotta go and sort of have to work on it. That's just, you gotta be agile. You gotta be willing to not admit defeat, but admit when something's not quite working the way that you want to, and try and look for an alternative solution.
Well, another thing on that one too for us is like at a certain point you hit a stage where you have to start putting aside every time you're developing something like app code, you have to put aside some time to say, and at least ask the question, and do I need to put aside some time as well for any infrastructure automation and deployment changes to you have to bake that into all your estimates. It's very common for people to say, well, I'll just do this, this, and this in my app. It's going to take me 3 days or whatever, and then never bake that in. And then get to the end of those 3 days and realize that you need to go patch for like 1.5 days to write the infrastructure stuff and the deployment stuff as well. So you need to get in the habit of baking that into all of your estimates and anytime you're planning. I think we're at this interesting point where I think now we even just need a kind of like a full-time person who isn't being forced to always think about app code, who can now go think primarily about deployment and infrastructure as well.
You don't have them at 50 people.
Well, no, we spread it around the team. I mean, in a sense, that's part of the DevOps mentality is to say spread it among everyone. Everyone's a DevOps person.
Toss up on that one.
Yeah, some people take that approach where everyone should be DevOps, but I'm starting to see that the where that ends up biting you is when there's experience component. There's also when no one's thinking about it as their primary concern, it has a tendency to just fall by the wayside.
Second class citizen.
Yeah.
I don't think DevOps and specialization are mutually exclusive, right? Like it's okay to have a DevOps team where there are no silos and everybody can do everything, but you are primarily the deploy and release guy, and you are primarily the systems infrastructure guy, and you're mostly monitoring and dashboards or whatever. Like having specialization is good, and you shouldn't just throw that out just because we've all decided that DevOps is the way to go.
But you have to force that, right? I mean, well, forcing is not the right term, but you have to make sure that those people are doing all of those different kind of disciplines, right? So it's for a long time we had a job rec at HubSpot that was for MySQL DBA, and I was like, why the hell do we have a DBA for our job rec? This person's going to do way more than just what a classic DBA does. And a DBA is not the person you're looking for. You're looking for a person who's, I think John Allspaw uses the term cone-shaped people, really wide and pretty deep.
So I'm more saying that if you take the approach, if you bake in your cycle, even if you're good about saying, I'm going to bake in my cycle a little bit of time for DevOps, so every engineer is going to, when they're planning something, think about the app code, a little bit of time for DevOps. You're still going to get caught, even when you're doing that, which I think is a pretty good spot to begin, you're still going to get caught in a rut where you're only ever going to do enough infrastructure stuff to just, keep things going at the rate they're going. You're never going to undertake a truly, life-changing, efficiency-changing project. You're never going to say, wait a minute, what's something that we can do to increase everyone's efficiency 10%? And so I think you need to step back and occasionally
needs to bake in that time, right?
Yeah.
That's a cultural thing that you need to take into account and get everybody up and down the food chain.
There needs to be someone advocating that, I guess that's my point.
So I'm probably coming at this on the other side. I actually am. The fact that my title is DevOps is in fact I'm not actually happy about that in some ways. I much prefer to be TechOps or something like that. Now, DevOps as a culture means that to me, mostly my peers who are in Lapsa using Sage area and some of those ones, and even some of the folks that are Velocity and those ones, are really coming at this from, yes, it's good to go ahead and it's all about communication and working with the devs. It doesn't mean you don't have ops and you don't have devs. That means you may have ops and devs who are working closely together and actually looking and seeing stand-ups and things like that. Because the truth is, any engineer who's doing Python development or Ruby development or whatever they're doing, there's a lot to read up on. I've spent probably hours 10 hours this week reading on just different monitoring and different ways of dealing with metrics and things like that. And I'm not talking about instrumenting code on that side. I'm talking about after the code has already been instrumented, how do I take and what do I do with those metrics? And what do I do with systems? And how do I keep up with testing and deploy tools and things along those lines? There's a crap ton of stuff that is really opsy that you can't keep up with the whole breadth of the entire industry. Especially if you define the industry as write a web application and have it run for that scale.
So you're basically making an argument for why we need a dedicated person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we have. I'm about to hire a second one. So is John. Jonathan's at 10. You guys are at 15. You're hiring a second one or more. I don't know.
The thing about like when you're doing a startup, it's it usually tends to be a few developers. It's very, very rarely like an ops guy as part of a founding team. So
I came in at 10.
Yeah, so then you end up getting just a ton more developers, and at a certain point, like, wait a minute, we don't have any ops people, we probably should get one.
Yeah.
DevOps is used as an excuse to basically say, we don't need to hire ops people because it's DevOps and everybody can do everything, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a common trap. Sorry.
So when we started out, I mean, until we got to about 10 people, every single person on the team coded, every single person on the team did deployments, every single person on the team worked on the right scale, right scripts that we were using. Everybody was full stack, from the Ruby down to the MongoDB layer. Right? There comes a point at which you have to start specializing. I mean, you hope to hold out for as long as you can and say everyone at least has the ability to work on any piece of your product. But even eventually you get big enough where that's just not possible anymore. So, and at that point, specialization is not an annoyance. It's valuable for you to have specialties, right? But the people, the kind of people you were talking earlier, developers who were saying, I don't want to touch anything that's related to ops, that's not a good attitude for a developer to have in general, regardless of whether they have a specialty. It's a hostility to technology is not necessarily going to make you an effective developer.
Yeah, I think you also, I mentioned it before, I think you also can get to a certain revenue scale where you can't have people accidentally screwing stuff up, right? And so there's just a different mindset, there's just a different sort of cadence to how you interact with systems and how you think about them. And something that looks really clunky and really slow to a regular engineer who's kind of agile and wants to move around quickly, an ops guy is just going to think about things slightly differently because it's so easy to, I'm going to make a config change to HA proxy today. By the way, nothing's getting to any of the servers, right? Even the best ops guy can make that mistake. And now you put somebody in front of that necessarily doesn't deal with that on a daily basis. I mean, it's just, at some point, specialization in terms of operations is as important as finding a guy who's really incredible with JavaScript on the front end, right? Who can bring in that expertise and bring in that knowledge and bring in that maturity around how to interact with X, right? And then everybody scales up to different sizes. We're 9, we're looking to go to 12. You're 1, you're looking to go to 2. There's no one size fits all. It's you right decision for the right company at the right time.
I mean, I've been doing this work for over 15 years at this point, and I've learned some things and made a lot of mistakes over the years, and I can't believe you managed to get to 50 people without dedicated, to be honest.
We hired our first kind of dedicated DevOps person about a year ago, but we really do need 1 or 2 more and stuff like that.
Well, I think it's not only a question of scale. I think it's the maturity of the DevOps tools that we're using now are getting more abstract to the point where we might be falling into the same trap again, where a dev just pushes a button and maybe they didn't update this config file to match their app code that they changed, so now ops still has to fix it. And so I think we should have to be very cognizant of not falling into the same reason that the DevOps movement was started.
See, I spend a ton of time writing code these days, so it's all ops specific stuff. I've not touched Python, the actual Django, but I spend a ton of time.
The thing to the point of maturity and not falling into traps, I think it's hard to do often, but I think you need to be cognizant of the things that could lead you down the wrong path. For instance, we didn't use any EBS-backed instances in Amazon. Why? Because it makes it too easy to leave around. You can take snapshots of it, you can move that on. It becomes a vector for someone maybe does not have the same mindset as you for having ephemeral type instances.
EBS is fantastic. I can reattach it to the new box.
Exactly. And bring all
It's
the
the greatest invention ever.
Yeah. Or I mean, I fought for Vision IOPS for the longest time because it's telling me that we are vertically scaling when perhaps we shouldn't. Right? Yep. Granted, those things are nice. They're sexy. Like we all want to use them. They're fast. But I mean, I think it takes a mindset of maturity to say like, okay, this is not the right thing to put out and want.
Well, I have to catch my train back to conference. So I'm gonna open it back up to questions. However long you guys want to stick around. Thanks for coming to the first Boston DevOps 2014. Keep going strong.
Thank you. Sit up here or just thank you. Yeah. Mingle.
Eat more pizza. Please.
Did that go okay?
That's good.